Chapter 3: Politics and Identity. Yes, I could have been a judge, but I never had the Latin for the judging. I just never had sufficient of it to get through the rigorous judging exam. They're noted for their rigor. People come staggering out saying, "My God, what a rigorous exam," and so I became a minor. Peter Cook, Beyond the Fringe, 1961. The most important postmodernist ethical argument concerns the relationship between discourse and power. A discourse here means a historically evolved set of interlocking and mutually supporting statements which are used to define and describe a subject matter. Crudely, it is the language of the main intellectual disciplines, for example, the discursive practices of law, medicine, aesthetics, judgment, and so on. These discourses are used by lawyers, doctors, and others, do not just implicitly accept some kind of dominating theory to guide them. For example, in the guise of paradigm, as used by those engaged in orthodox science, they involve politically contentious activities not just because of the certainty with which they describe and define people who is an immigrant or an asylum seeker or a criminal or mad or a terrorist, but because such discourses at the same time express the political authority of their users. Prisoner: "As God is my judge, my lord, I am not guilty." Judge: "He is not, I am, you are." 6 months. The power of words. All reasonably systematic users of language are to be seen as having a particular power-enforcing function. You believe what the young surgeon tells you, and so give him permission to anesthetize you, cut you up, and help you recover. The language game of the discourse express and enact the authority of those who are empowered to use it within a social group, which includes hospitals, law courts, board of examiners, and professors like me writing books like this. It can also be used to subordinate or exclude or marginalize those who are outside it: witches, mesmerists, faith healers, homosexual, communist sympathizers, anarchist protesters. Here is one of the many connections with the philosophical theme explored above. The most influential analysis of this relationship between discourse and power was given by Michel Foucault in his studies of the history of practice in law, penology, and medicine. Such powerful discourses are rather obviously designed to exclude and control people, such as those diagnosed as criminally insane or ill, and these exclusions arise for Foucault in a classically Marxist manner. The general judicial form of guaranteed a system of rights that were egalitarian in principle was unsupported by these fine everyday physical mechanisms, by all those systems of micropower that are essentially non-egalitarian and asymmetrical that we call the disciplines, such as exams, hospitals, prisons, the regulations of workshop, schools, and army. Michel Foucault, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, 1977. Foucault adopts the victim's position and analyzes power from the bottom up, and not simply as an imposition of the interest of the class above. He tries to show that the will to exercise power beats humanitarian egalitarianism every time, and implies that even the Enlightenment reliance upon universal principle and reason is always insufficiently totalitarian, because the appeal to an always correct reason is itself a system of control and will always exclude what it makes marginal simply by seeing it as non-rational. For Foucault, these supposed irrationalities would include matters of desire, feeling, sexuality, femininity, and art. Foucault is deeply anti-progressive. He is an anti-Whig historian who chronicles the rise of unfreedom. In doing this, he looks for what he calls the episteme, that is, the largely unconscious assumptions concerning intellectual order that underline the historical states of particular societies. These are the historical a priori conditions of a period which delimit the totality of experience in a field of knowledge, define the mode of being of the objects in the field, and provide man's everyday perceptions with theoretical powers. They also define the conditions under which a discourse can be true. We need to dig for this in history, hence what Foucault calls the archaeology of this episteme. These conditions lie below perception. They are not always explicit, so that the episteme is a kind of epistemological unconscious foreign age. Foucault subjects all this material to a leftist critique to show what and whom it excludes, and how power and knowledge fundamentally interact. For example, when the medically trained reasonable people define themselves against the unreasonable and, having made their judgments, proceed to lock them up in asylum. Sexist, racist, and imperialist all use similar techniques. They make their normalizing discourse prevail, and in doing so, they can actually create or bring into being the deviant, or what many postmodernists call the other. Their discourse actually helps to create the subordinate identities of those who are excluded from participation in it. Foucault takes homosexuals, women, and criminally insane, non-whites, and prisoners as standard example of the other. This opposition and antipathy is really quite obvious in schools, armies, and in the process of imperial rule, and so postmodernist thought has inspired much work of the nature of the post-colonial subject. What is distinctive here of postmodernism is the basis of the analysis in the linguistic, and as we have already seen in looking at Derrida and Barthes, people become signs, part of the play of language. Hence, for example, Laura Mulvey's much cited and frequently reprinted visual pleasure and narrative cinema, which includes the magnificency over confident generalization that woman that stands in a patriarchal culture as a signifier for the male other, bound by a symbolic order in which man can live out his fantasies and obsessions through linguistic command by imposing them on the silent image of a woman still tied to her place as a bearer of meaning, not maker of meaning. Screen 16, number 3, autumn 1975. We thus talk people into being just as we do universities and the euro. But the postmodernists go on from this to make an important, more general point. Discourse, from this point of view, is like a Derridean language. It isn't the property of controlling individuals. It goes beyond them, nor is it only to be found in obvious formal contexts like that of the law court. It is out and about in society from top to bottom, from the pronouncements of judges to scientific journals to TV advertisement, pop songs, and the broadsheets of the day. And the more dominant a discourse is within a group or society, the more natural it can seem, and the more it tends to appeal to the ways of nature to justify itself. Nature as a whole may seem to proclaim in the ordering powers of a god, or the hidden orders discovered by scientists, or to contain breeds beyond the pale, or women, or the mad, who are to be thought of as inherently, that is, naturally more animal, less reasonable than us, and so on. We internalize these subordinating norms, which, as Derrida and Foucault point out, are often intimately part of our language, without always realizing that this is what they are. We go along with them unwittingly, as if they were facts about nature rather than psychologically and politically motivated features of us talk about it. The asylum, for example, as described by Foucault, is driven by the discourses of the doctor and miners, and mirrors the authoritarian structures of the bourgeois society which surrounds it. It is a microcosm for family, transgression, and madness relations. Foucault, on the other hand, or rather on the left, is in favor of folly and against bourgeois reason, and although his history of asylums is not nearly as empirically well founded as it ought to be, the political point he wished to make about authority and power went home. Like so many in the 1960s, such as the analyst R.D. Laing in the Divide and Self, or Ken Case in the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Foucault casts the insane in the role of society's victims and stresses society's failures to see that the insane are also deeply unhappy individuals. He makes a similar analysis and a similar overgeneralization about prisons, which supposedly reveal the basis carceral nature of the society around them. Society, in Foucault's Kafkaesque rewrite of Orwell 1984, suffers from a universal panopticism. Universal panopticism. We are all being secretly surveyed and controlled, but this is to pretend, and the usual forms of social control, like working to a routine and being supervised, are the same things as being in prison, but society and prison are not the same. I have given above some obvious examples of the abuse of power. These offend our Enlightenment intuition about universal justice and the right of the individual to autonomy. But it is one of Foucault's many defects that he fails to give anything like an ethical account of power in general. He wants struggle rather than submission, but he doesn't very clearly say why. For him, power seems to be a kind of electrical force, in an inevitable accompaniment to all human activity, like gravity, although his thought presupposes a leftist, indeed Marxist analysis. He avoids any obvious political commentaries and more moral theories, and so in the end, although he is a classical resistor, he does little more than recommend, rather as Lyotard does, small-scale local reforms. As Terry Eagleton puts it, Foucault objects to particular regimes of power not on moral grounds, but simply on the grounds that they are regimes as such, and so, from some vague libertarian standpoint, repressive. Just as importantly, in looking in the functions of discourse, Foucault fails to allow for the ways in which it actually works through individuals, and so he underestimates the importance of individual agency and responsibility. We all know we should distrust Angelo in Shakespeare's Measure for Measure when he says to Isabella, "It is law, not I, condemns your brother." For Foucauldians, it is not so much the individual who does dreadful things as the discourse of power that flows through him or her. Foucault thus provides a sophisticated language-based version of the class antagonism of Marx. He relies on beliefs about the inherent evil of the individual's class position or professional position seen as discourse, regardless of the morality of his or her individual conduct. Readers of this book will have hardly failed to notice the unwillingness of politicians to accept individual responsibility for their actions, or even for that of their subordinates, as they used to do. They also tend to express wildly prejudiced views on the grounds that they are held by large numbers of people, perhaps recent immigrants, of those seeking asylum, or neighbors of a different ethnic group, and in doing so say that they are merely to be seen as articulating those views as a political importance. In all such cases, they just allow discourse to wash through them, and when their conducts have been questionable, they do not simply say, I did not do it, or I did it, but rather claim to have been exonerated or excused by the discourse of the report that has been made upon their actions. To that extent, they indeed demonstrate the Foucauldian episteme of their age, and with that the disadvantages of the inherently politicizing rather than a moral view of individual responsibility. Self and identity. The analysis of the relation between discourse and power had a further and important consequence for postmodernists. It led to a distinctive view of the nature of the self, which was a challenge to the individualist rationalism and the emphasis of personal autonomy of the liberals. Indeed, the term preferred by postmodernists to apply to individuals is not so much self as subject, because the latter term implicitly draws attention to the subjected condition of persons who are, whether they know it or not, controlled if you are on the left, or constitute if you are in the middle, by the ideologically motivated discourses of power which predominate in the society they inhabit. The extraordinary achievement of Foucault and those who thought like him was to, given their analysis of the workings of power, to go on to make one of the most influential of postmodernist claims, the claim that such discourses entailed, imposed, demanded the many possibilities. Here continue the interest of the claim, a particular kind of identity for all those who were affected by them. In postmodernist jargon, they are continued to the subject. In postmodernist jargon, they constitute the subject. They constitute the subject. Of course, the fact that institutions and their discourses demand that you be a particular sort of person to fit in was hardly unknown. Anyone who has been in a school or sports team or a military organization, or given birth to a baby in a hospital, let alone read some of the organization man sociology of the 1950s, is to some degree aware of this point. But the postmodernist argument was an exceptionally subtle one. We don't just play roles in such cases, but our very identity, the notion we have of ourselves, it is at issue when we are affected by discourses of power. These, of course, run from those which are directly concerned with matters of identity. In religion and in therapy, from Freudianism to psychobabble, to those which are far less obviously so, as in the case of a woman responding to the female led in a male-dominant Hollywood film, or to paintings or of the nude in the male-dominated museum, or the teenager in front of the TV set. All discourses put you in your place. I am, as usual, citing examples that are more everyday and intuitively appealing than the rather heavily buried and theorized examples to be found in the abounding academic literature of postmodernism. Postmodernist critics go on to make political claims concerning the nature of the subject. One of these is that the conflicting language of power which circulates through and within individuals actually constitutes the self. The subject cannot, on this view, ever stand aside from actual social conditions and judge them from a rational, autonomous point of view, as moral philosopher in the Anglo-American Kantian tradition like John Rawls and Thomas Nagel argue. The thoughts and expressions of the male individual, for example, are seen as part of pattern of contaminated patriarchal discourse, which are in any case in conflict, and of which he is the mere epiphenomenon. This chucks out the Kantian unifying ego in favor of a postmodernist updating of the Freudian model of person as undergoing an initial conflict between systems. As Sayla Ben-Habib, a professor of government at Harvard University, puts it, conflating as she does, so Derridean and Foucauldian language about language, language about language. The subject is replaced by a system of structures, oppositions, and differences which, to be intelligible, needs to be viewed as products of a living subjectively at all. You and I are the same sides of such conflicts, language of power, and the self is merely another position in language. Structuring the Self, 1992. The consequence of this view of the nature of the individual can be very clearly seen in many postmodernist literary texts which contrast in this respect with the liberal tradition of the novel as continued in this period by writers like Angus Wilson, Iris Murdoch, John Updike, Philip Roth, and Saul Bellow. For a literary critic and historian of postmodernism like Linda Hutcheon, such novels and Salman Rushdi's Midnight Children challenge the humanist assumption of a unified self and an integrated consciousness. Postmodernist fiction puts into question that an entire series of interconnected concepts that have come to be associated with what we conveniently label as liberal humanism: autonomy, transcendence, certainty, authority, unity, totalization, system, universalization, center, continuity, theology, closure, hierarchy, homogeneity, uniqueness, and origin. Linda Hutchison, The Poetics of Postmodernism, 1988. And so, in much recent American fiction, the focus of attention has shifted from the psychology of character and reducible essence, something human, to the inadequacy of the concept of character, to recognition of subjectivity as the trace of plural and intersecting discourses, of non-unified contradictory ideologies, the product of a rational system, which is finally that of discourse. A classic and influential instance is the title story of John Barth's Lost in the Funhouse, 1968, Funhouse, in which the narrator, Ambrose, describes the difficulty of writing a story called Lost in the Funhouse, about a character called Ambrose who is lost in the funhouse. He's supposed to be visiting Ocean City with his family sometime during the last war, part of which involves going to a funhouse. But he is described by an author who is perpetually aware of the fact that he is telling a story and that he is using literary conventions to do so. So far, he says, there has been no real dialogue, very little sensory detail, and nothing in the way of a theme, and Ambrose is just a function of his author's story, so that one possible ending would be to have Ambrose come across another lost person in the dark. We are perpetually deprived of any illusion of Ambrose's autonomy in favor of our seeing him truthfully enough as the creature of the person who is writing him, who also acts like a stereotypical author who, as his remarks about the function of italics or the lack of a climax in his own story imply, seems to be trying to apply the correct rules for narrative, which he has learned in writing school. What goes for a character in a novel goes for author. They too are spoken by the language they give speech to, that of the writing school, for example, and it goes too for the reader, who is in no better case than the author, also being dispersed among the interstices of language, enmeshed with and finally lost among the endless relay of signification. A human being, on this view, is not a unity, not autonomous, but a process, is perpetually in construction, perpetually open to change. Contradictory. The postmodernist notion of human identity as essentially constructed like a fiction is always to be found in the visual arts, as is to be seen in Cindy Sherman's series of photographs, unified film stills, and its successors. In each of these, Sherman impersonates and in each of these, Sherman impersonates film actresses, disguising herself more or less in different clothing and in different implied situations which are typical or stereotypical in film. In the process, we see her adapting the discourses of film to present herself in a photographic still as all sorts of different people, but all versions of femininity are seen in the discourses of a mass medium. Of course, this is just another version of acting, but the photographs are not based on any particular film, and they rather schematically raise questions about the ways in which Sherman can preserve or not preserve an underlying identity in all these different roles. In so doing, they also put into question the notion of the real Cindy Sherman, which photographs could possibly convince us that we are seeing this, an open, sincere, emotional, or even naked one. But each of these would be just the result of another convention, another discourse. For Roland Barthes, the ideal postmodernist work of art recognizes these strategies and playful limitations of human identity and discourse, precisely because this play and division has desirable moral consequences. It disposes of precisely the Kantian unity of the person which makes for social order and moral orthodoxy. The pleasure of the text does not prefer one ideology to another. However, this impertinence does not proceed from liberalism but from perversion. The text, its reading, are split. What is split is the moral unity that society demands of every human product. Barthes exemplifies his own remarkably evasive doctrine in his autobiographical works, notably through the novelistic conception of himself in a Lover Discourse, 1977, in which the grammar of French in the original adroitly keeps the sexual orientation of the protagonist ambiguous, as does the language of Auden's love poetry. And Roland Barthes, by Roland Barthes, 1975, an autobiography begins by announcing in an epigraph that all of this must be thought of as being said by a character in a novel. So there are two voices in the book, Barthes' own, or that of the author, which we might infer, and that of Barthes as a fictional character. Barthes also reviewed his own book, this time with a reviewer persona. Such deconstructions of the moral unity of the subject and the classically liberal desire to help the self to evade some of the repressive ideological boundaries it encounters are very different things. Indeed, the justification for our desire to evade or withdraw such boundaries, such as those which confer sexual identity, already depends on a notion of the new moral unity or integrity or autonomy we can achieve. Once the restrictive boundary is removed, this becomes obvious when, for example, we are urged to recognize the different but non-fractured identities of the homosexual and the heterosexual, or of male and female, by refusing to fall into the ideological trap analyzed by Derrida of seeing the one as an inferior version of the other. What postmodern theory helps us to see is that we are all constructed in a broad range of subject positions through which we move with more or less case, so that all of us are combinations of class, race, ethnic, regional, generational, sexual, and gender positions. Many postmodernists make the rather pessimistic analysis in the hope of liberalizing us from it. Once we have been made aware of the dire effect of contradictory discourses upon us, we are expected to be able to find some kind of way out of it. The politics of difference. Postmodernists may not give a particularly convincing account of the nature of the self, as it might appear in a moral philosophy concerned with responsibility, but they do very successfully adapt Foucauldian arguments to show the ways in which discourses of power are used in all societies to marginalize subordinate groups. For such discourses of power do not just contribute to the descending and deconstruction of the self, they also serve to marginalize those people who do not partake in them. Again, there are plenty of these authentic marginalized figures to be encountered within postmodernist fiction, such as Coalhouse Walker in Doctorow's Ragtime, Feeble in Angela Cardell's Nights at the Circus, and Salim Sinai in Rashid's Midnight Children. Salim is not of any great social importance, and yet his crisis of identity, along with his magical telepathic relationship to those who were also born at the moment of India's independence, is metaphorically seen as parallel to the crisis of the nation as a whole. He indeed tells us, "I was linked to history both literally and metaphorically, both actively and passively." But the political history of India is deconstructed to show that the marginal can be seen as the central. Indeed, Sinai is diffused, like the reader following his text, into all sorts of surrounding fragmentary narratives. The novel does not try to make any sense of the emotional logic of the individual's life, as is typically of realist fiction, but uses its magic realist techniques to show the self as constituted by the conflicts and contradictions of the historical event, to the point of an absurdist hyperbole, as when Salim remarks, "Nehru's death, too, was all my fault." Nehru's death, too, was all my fault. Even his face is the whole map of India, but by the end of the novel he is no more than a big-headed, top-heavy dwarf. The novel owes a great deal to Gunter Grass, the tin drum. Postmodernists thought, in attacking the idea of notional center of dominant ideology, facilitated the promotion of a politics of difference. Under postmodern conditions, the ordered class politics preferred by socialists has given way to a far more diffuse and pluralistic identity politics, which often involve the self-constructious assertion of a marginalized identity against the dominant discourse. An example of this, which is undoubtedly central to the political of the period since the late 1960s, is the relationship between postmodernism and feminism. The argument here is that women are excluded from the patriarchal symbolic order or from the dominant male discourse, and indeed that they have been defined or othered as inferior with respect to it. They are subjected to a Derridean false hierarchy by being assigned weak values opposite to the strong ones invested in masculinity. We saw a bit of this in looking at the egg and sperm controversy. Much feminist thought therefore has in common with postmodernism that it attacks the legitimizing meta-discourse used by males designed to keep them in power, and it seeks at individual improvement against this. Individual empowerment against this. But I agree with critics of this position, like Ben Habib, that the woman who does this shouldn't be seen as occupying merely another position in language. For the postmodernist view of this socially constructed self-ignored the way self-ignores. For the postmodernist view of this socially constructed, self-ignores the way the self is constructed by an individual's maintenance of an original, often idiosyncratic narrative of him or himself, her or herself. This is the key to creativity in the individual. This evidence for the growth of an individual through the socialization process is neglected by social construction theories of the self. We can, of course, discern the conventional. All right, let's finish it.